Dr. Matthew MacDougall, the head neurosurgeon at Neuralink, was a guest on the Huberman Lab Podcast. Neuralink, an organization that aims to improve brain design, wants to use existing knowledge of brain function from neurosurgery and neuroscience, combined with machine learning, robotics, computer science, and novel devices, to augment memory, cognition, and communication between individuals and machines. Dr. Huberman calls neurosurgeons the astronauts of neuroscience because they explore the human brain, probe and cut it, stimulating it and monitor the changes in cognition, behavior, and speech brought about by structural and functional changes in the brain. Dr. MacDougall explains his own experience implanting a radio receiver in the periphery of his own and his family's bodies simply to overcome daily challenges through combining novel machines and devices with our nervous system and different objects and technologies within the world. Dr. Matthew MacDougall also discusses the potential implications of using earbuds, specifically relating to heat generated near the brain. He likens the body's cooling system to that of a car's radiator, in which blood carries mostly water to regulate temperature and dissipate heat. He emphasizes that the body is capable of carrying heat away and that there may be a tiny temperature variation from the use of earbuds, but it is not significant enough to cause a problem. Dr. MacDougall then shifts the conversation to discuss brain augmentation, specifically in regard to Neuralink's goal of getting quadriplegics walking again. He explains that the first step is to reconnect the patient's muscle system to their motor cortex to allow them agency over the movement of objects in the world. The next step would be to reconnect the brain to the rest of the body by bypassing the damaged area of the spinal cord through an implant connected to the brain and spinal cord. Dr. MacDougall emphasizes the incredible work of basic scientists in the last century in motor cortex recordings, which have contributed to this work. MacDougall praises academic researchers and pioneers who devoted years to studying the anatomy and physiology of neural tissue. He mentions Krishna Shenoy as a major pioneer in this area who, along with others, made it possible for clinical organizations such as Neuralink to do big expeditions in the field. MacDougall also briefly introduces Inside Tracker, a personalized platform that helps individuals better understand and monitor their blood and DNA health markers. The two then discuss the potential for Neuralink's technology to augment cognitive abilities such as memory and communication through the use of implanted devices in the hippocampus or other areas of the brain. MacDougall suggests that the idea of implanting chips to enhance memory ability is one amongst many lofty ideas thrown out early on. Another outrageous possibility mentioned was the ability to hear each other's thoughts through implanted chips. MacDougall explains that such technology is not far-fetched, as humans already have the ability to communicate without speaking or looking at each other by texting. They provide the possibility of implanting a device in a verbally focused area of the brain to allow individuals to more naturally speak their thoughts while others listen. They also talk about the potential of using neural signals to create speech and communication devices. This would involve implanting a device that could be cued by neural signals to create speech or other communication messages. While individual parts of this process have been tackled separately by different labs, there is not yet a comprehensive device that can be used from end to end. However, there are peripheral devices that can offer some similar experiences without invasive surgery, such as neosensory, which translates sound into touch sensations. These devices can enrich experiences in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise, but it is hard to measure their efficacy. One way to measure this is through bit rate, which is the amount of useful information that can be conveyed into or out of the brain. Peripheral devices may have a lower bit rate, but they have a low barrier to adoption and are potentially more readily used. Dr. Matthew MacDougall brings up the concept of the theoretical maximum for technology like Neuralink, the amount of information from the brain and back to the brain that can be processed usefully. He explains that this theoretical maximum is disappointingly low for many technologies, even if perfectly executed. However, what attracts many people to Neuralink is that the ceiling of its potential is incredibly high in terms of the number of neurons it could interface with as this technology is further refined and developed. The aim for this type of brain interface is to act as a semantic prosthetic, like an AI assistant to your cognitive abilities. Dr. MacDougall then gives an example of how people who are blind have been using assistive devices like canes for a long time, which translate visual cues into somatosensory cues. Blind people can use other sensory cues to navigate, like hearing changes in wind and sound, or even the emotional state of a dog used as a guide. He makes a comparison with Neuralink, saying that this type of technology is trying to perform the same assistance as a seeing eye dog, but with robotics inserted through chips. Dr. Huberman expands on the discussion, bringing up the role of AI and machine learning in these types of brain-machine interfaces. He questions to what extent these interfaces can learn and improve over time, and how the use of machine learning and software can adapt to the firing patterns of the brain. Dr. MacDougall explains that the software intelligence paired with the human intelligence of the user can learn from each other, with the user getting better at using the device and the software adapting to the recorded signals from the device to focus on meaningful signals towards intended movements. Dr. MacDougall discusses how humans are able to learn how to control things through the aid of software and video games. He compares this to a scenario where someone is asked to play the piano and each key produces a different sound randomly over time. However, the human brain is able to learn and map to a semi-stable state that allows them to navigate the task presented to them. The hosts then discuss how video games can be used as a training environment for people to improve their motor skills and abilities, such as visual detection. Dr. MacDougall also mentions how playing video games can potentially make people more proficient in learning and motor execution. Additionally, he notes that some studies have shown that surgeons who play video games have better motor skills in the operating room. Dr. Matthew MacDougall talks about the animal experimentation that Neuralink has conducted in order to make progress with their goals. MacDougall explains that although the idea of experimentation on animals can evoke strong emotions in people, it is a necessary step in medical advancements. Neuralink has held online symposia to share the progress they have made with implant devices in pigs and monkeys. MacDougall explains that Neuralink is an animal-loving organization and follows guidelines provided by governing bodies to ensure minimum discomfort to animals. He notes that animal research is necessary because there is currently no known way to help people without using animals. So it's important to ensure experimental devices are safe through animal testing before seeking FDA approval. Neuralink also goes above and beyond in giving agency to animals, for example, allowing them to opt out of the experiments beyond their surgery. MacDougall notes that if laws were changed and willing human participants were sought for early-stage clinical research, it could potentially spare animals being unwilling participants. Dr. Matthew MacDougall explains the humane treatment of animals used in their research compared to typical laboratory scenarios where animals are deprived of food and water to motivate them to perform tasks. They never resort to this in their laboratory, and animals always have access to food and water. He also mentions that training animals to perform tasks in laboratory settings is difficult and time-consuming, which may result in some researchers defaulting to water deprivation. They use pigs in their medical device research as they have similar hearts to humans. Pigs are not required to perform any specific task, and they are used as a biological platform with a skull close enough in size and shape to humans to study the safety of the device. On the other hand, monkeys are mainly used to ensure that they get good signals out of the device, and what they expect to see in humans is validated on a functional level. They utilize a small entry site of around 2 mm through the skull, which must be done by a neurosurgeon to limit infection. Finally, Dr. Matthew MacDougall mentions that the skull is a good biological adaptation given the tools biological organisms develop within their mother's uterus. However, there are a few puzzling vulnerabilities, such as thin bones in the skull, that may make humans vulnerable to traumatic brain injury. The skull's design flaw, known as God's little joke, is the thinness of the temporal bone located in the area near the eyes with one of the largest arteries attached to the inside of it. The bone can easily fracture, and the sharp edges of the fractured bone can cut the middle meningeal artery that leads to a big blood clot crushing the brain. This is one of the most obvious failure modes in the human skull's design. However, the fluid sheath around the brain helps prevent traumatic brain injury by providing a protective cushion against bruising or bleeding of the brain. Most traumatic brain injuries occur due to car accidents, construction work, or environmental accidents, and helmets usually do not cover the region near the eyes. While there is no instance of this exact injury type in sports, people should still avoid head injury and make sure it gets treated if it occurs. As for practices that people can do to keep their brain healthy, the obvious one is to avoid getting head injuries and getting them treated if they occur. However, the most common source of brain damage is chronic, heavy alcohol consumption, which causes brain atrophy. People should avoid drinking excessively to prevent brain damage. According to Dr. Matthew MacDougall, excessive alcohol consumption can lead to brain atrophy and neuron death. Studies from the UK Brain Bank show a direct relationship between the amount of alcohol consumed and the amount of brain atrophy. MacDougall points out that it is alarming that alcohol consumption and advertising are still prevalent, even with this knowledge. Similarly, while drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, modafinil, and armodafinil can be beneficial in prescribed quantities, chronic use of these drugs has not been well researched in terms of their effects on brain structure and function. On the topic of neuroplasticity, MacDougall mentions that there is not one specific brain area that can be stimulated to invoke plasticity. However, experiments by Mike Merzenek and colleagues at UCSF demonstrated that stimulating the nucleus basalis or ventral tegmental area with a tone can result in massive plasticity. In contrast, experiments by Carl Ashley showed that animals could do well in learning environments even with portions of their brain removed. MacDougall believes that reconciling these discrepant findings is a matter of accounting for different species and age differences. While the consequences of removing a small portion of a rabbit or pig brain may be minimal, removing the equivalent portion of a human brain may result in profound losses. Dr. MacDougall discusses the brain's plasticity and redundancy in response to brain damage depending on when it occurs in life. He provides an example of how taking out half of the brain in a very young baby can cause the remaining half to subsume the functions lost on the other side because of the brain's plasticity. However, adult humans are vulnerable to losing small parts of their brains and losing discrete functions. Additionally, he supports the idea of introducing sensors for monitoring the alertness of a driver in cars, such as the Tesla, to prevent accidents caused by sleepiness. The Tesla car currently has a small camera near the rearview mirror that detects whether the driver's eyes are open or not, which is a simple eye tracking program. He discusses his wish for brain augmentation and brain-machine interfaces to tackle addiction, depression, suicide, obesity, and malfunctions of the brain. He dreams of the full expansion of human cognition into AI, unrestricted communication, and having no limitation for what one thinks. Dr. Huberman highlights the importance of maintaining healthy blood glucose levels, as hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia may negatively impact the cells in the body and nervous system. He mentions that using a continuous glucose monitor such as Levels can help individuals understand how their daily routines and habits, including food intake patterns and exercise, affect their blood sugar levels. Dr. MacDougall then shares his perspective on the brain as an organ and its functions. He describes the brain as a 3-pound lump of meat nestled in the skull, which produces human behaviors and life from electrical impulses. Dr. MacDougall emphasizes that the brain is a collection of functional modules that work together to control everything from hormone levels and vision to muscle movement. He also shares a personal story of a patient with frontal lobe damage, which led to a loss of impulse control and tragic consequences. As a neurosurgeon, Dr. MacDougall considers working with the brain as a high-stakes proposition with significant potential consequences. Dr. Andrew Huberman and Dr. Matthew MacDougall bring up the potential for human brains to be connected together through technology, creating a multi-brain organism. Dr. MacDougall encourages those interested in this technology to apply for jobs at Neuralink, stating that they need the brightest minds to work on these difficult problems. The conversation then shifts to discussing the honesty and transparency of Neuralink, with Dr. Huberman commending them for being public-facing and detailing the mission of the company. He also applauds Dr. MacDougall for his dedication to the field and for embodying the work in everything he does. Additionally, the podcast promotes a patient registry for quadriplegics who may be interested in being part of future Neuralink clinical trials. Dr. Matthew MacDougall brings up a relatively new surgical technique used to remove tumors deep inside the brain. This technique involves creating a 2-millimeter drill hole in the skull, passing a little fiber optic cannula down to the tumor and attaching it to a laser to heat up the tumor while being monitored by an MRI in real time. Using this approach, it is possible to eliminate tumors previously considered catastrophic to operate on without causing much collateral damage. Dr. MacDougall explains that the frontal lobes of the brain act as filters, selectively holding back impulses from the rest of the brain. He cites a case of a patient who had lost the ability to regulate his impulses due to frontal lobe damage, leading to him having inappropriate impulses towards his nurse. Dr. MacDougall suggests that the frontal lobes are responsible for selective filtering of behavior and calming down the rest of the brain from acting impulsively. Additionally, he discusses the role of animal research in neuroscience and shares a personal anecdote about how he stayed awake for several days during neurophysiological experiments to collect data. Dr. Matthew MacDougall explains that sleep deprivation has broad effects on the brain, affecting various regions such as the forebrain and visual cortex. He also notes that plasticity in the brain tends to decrease with age, making changes in behavior and learning new things harder for older people. Dr. MacDougall suggests that pharmacologic agents, particularly psychedelics, may have a broader impact on plasticity compared to implanted electrodes in computers that have a more focused electrical stimulation target. He also admits that he is uncertain about the specific goals of Neuralink, but is excited about the mystical quality of the engineers tackling big problems and going for it, similar to the missions spearheaded by Elon for SpaceX, Tesla, and other endeavors. Neuralink is a company that is focused on reducing human suffering by decreasing the impact of certain medical problems on people. Their primary focus in the near term is to help people with terrible medical problems that have no options for motor control. They're aiming to develop a neural implant that is placed in the motor cortex of the brain of people who have experienced spinal cord injuries, who are essentially quadriplegic and have no control over their limbs. By placing these electrodes in the brain, the person can then control a computer, such as a mouse or keyboard, by sending their motor intentions directly from their brain into the device, thereby regaining their digital freedom and connecting with the world through the internet. Neuralink uses robots to insert the electrodes accurately into the brain, as the electrodes are tiny and the blood vessels on the surface of the brain are so numerous and densely packed that it is impossible for a human hand to perform the electrode placement. Additionally, human surgeons inevitably run out of motor skills sufficient to execute the process required. Although the long-term goal of Neuralink is to use brain interfaces to bring AI as a tool embedded in the brain that a human can use to augment their capabilities, they are primarily focused on reducing human suffering. On the desired near-term roadmap, they are focused on people with medical problems, such as paralysis, that currently have no options for motor control, which is a necessary step in reducing human suffering. The conversation begins discussing the physical constraints of the current approach to addressing any function that lives on the surface of the brain. The focus is currently on surface features such as motor control, as it is not possible to address deeper functionalities like mood, appetite, pain, addiction, and sleep. The guest in the show talks about the importance of gut health and the role of gut microbiota that communicate with the brain, the immune system, and all the biological systems of the body to impact its health. The show then discusses the functions of the outer and deeper parts of the brain. The outer portion of the brain is made of neocortex, consisting of bumpy stuff that looks like sea coral, while underneath it resides the brain structures that control mood, hormone output, etc. Lesions or stimulation in deeper regions of the brain lead to more predictable outcomes in terms of deficits or improvements in function. There are certain areas in the deeper parts of the brain that are referred to as firmware or housekeeping functions that have more stereotyped functions. The guest describes the human brain as a monkey brain with a supercomputer placed on the outside. The conversation shifts to peculiar and intriguing neurons in the brain. The guest talks about the instance of gelastic seizures, an uncontrollable fit of laughter that is seen in kids that have a tumor in the hypothalamus. The laughter is humorless and reflexive, leading to zombie-like behavior. These functions that cause disruptive fits of laughter can be broken due to improperly wiring or functioning neurons. Dr. MacDougall explains how neural electrodes can be strategically placed in multiple brain regions to stimulate movement in quadriplegic patients, though the signals do not necessarily reach past spinal cord lesions. Neuralink, a company that develops brain-machine interfaces, is solely focused on decoding the brain through electrical stimulation and recording, rather than combining pharmacology with stimulation. Neuralink's current goal is to enable patients to control electronic devices with their motor intentions alone, such as prosthetic hands and arms or mouse and keyboard movements. Dr. MacDougall emphasizes that transforming electrical signals from the motor cortex and decoding these signals to control the movements of external devices via smart algorithms is not a trivial problem, but can be partially mitigated by transferring some of the computational difficulty to software. While monkeys have been successfully trained to control a cursor on a screen using intelligent algorithms, it is not yet possible to communicate with or ask the monkey about their thoughts or movements. On the other hand, humans are expected to accelerate the research and produce more interesting results while decoding multitudes of useful signals in each area of the brain. For example, a lab at Stanford recently decoded speech signals from the hand movement area in the brain, demonstrating how intention and awareness of goals can shape outcomes in biology, a principle that has been explored for hundreds of years by scientists experimenting on themselves. Dr. Matthew MacDougall discusses the development of neuromodulation technology through the implantation of electrodes in the motor cortex. He poses a question to the listeners as to whether they would be willing to have electrodes implanted in their motor cortex for the purpose of advancing the technology, even if they are not paralyzed. Dr. MacDougall argues that by implanting electrodes in able-bodied individuals who deeply understand the technology and the goals of the experiment, the technology could be advanced faster, rather than putting electrodes into an imperative person and trying to diagnose why things aren't working right. Dr. MacDougall expresses excitement and willingness to implant himself with microelectrodes, as he thinks the safety threshold of the technology is already far beyond a commonly accepted safety threshold. Additionally, Dr. MacDougall explains the presence of a small RFID tag in his hand, which he uses for unlocking his house and doors at Neuralink, and it can also store private keys. He further explains that these RFID tags are coated in biocompatible glass and could last for a long period of time. Dr. Matthew MacDougall implanted a small RFID chip in his hand, coated with an additional layer of silicone to protect it from shattering while climbing. This procedure was done without any anesthesia by making a little cut in the skin on top of his hand with no immune response or swelling, and the materials used were completely biocompatible. The chip has no active electronics and could last the rest of his life, but he may upgrade it in the future. Dr. MacDougall's wife also got an RFID chip implanted to open doors without keys, which they consider to be their version of wedding rings. Dr. MacDougall believes that the energy levels involved in using Bluetooth headphones are so small that he is not worried about electromagnetic fields across the skull or the tiny amount of ionizing radiation that we all experience regardless of whether we use Bluetooth headphones or not. Check out the full podcast by clicking the link in the description below. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for listening to this podcast summary episode of The Pod Slice.